So we can render our scene by pressing this button down here if we just click that. And of course this slider right next to this controls the resolution being used to be rendered. So by default the resolution is 1920 by 1080. So this is 55% of 1920 by 1080, which gives us obviously smaller than 1920 by 1080, but renders much faster and is helpful for us doing tests. So if we need to get this even smaller to render some faster tests, we could use something like this, press render again, and you see that this rendered out much quicker. So down here where it says slot, we can switch back to slot 1, which these slots will automatically increment each time you render, so you'll be able to check your renders without having to change this. But if we wanted to render this out at full size, we would just drag this all the way up to 100%, press render, and we'll get the full 1920 by 1080 render. So we could press the tilde key or control up to expand this and use our mouse wheel to scroll in and out. If you want to see the exact pixel image size, you can always come here where it says view and press zoom 1:1, and this will show you the exact pixels, sort of similar to Photoshop. So I'll press my tilde key to back out of that. We can then, if we want, save this image just by pressing save image here, and then this will open up our file browser and we can choose a location to save this. So I could just click on my desktop here and call this generic render, I guess, and select what type we want to save this file as here. And PNG is usually good. And just press save as image. And now if I go to my desktop, here is the image we rendered. If we wanted to render the same scene with a transparent background, down here under output options, we can click use transparent. And then this time if we render, only the actual objects down in the camera view will be rendered and not the background. So we could save that, save image, and I could call this generic render transparent. And go back to my desktop. Here's the transparent one, and here's the regular one. So we know how to do all that, and to get back, we can just press go back here. Rendering an animation is not that much different, with a few exceptions. So if we're going to render an animation, let's go ahead and quickly make one. So I'm just going to press F to insert a keyframe on this cube, press G to grab, move it anywhere, press F again, G to grab, rotate, scale it, press F again, G to grab, press F again, G to grab, and R to rotate, Z to constrain this, maybe scale it down or something, press F again. And so I've just made this short 4-second long animation. If I press back and press play, we can see our cube scurrying all about. So to make this more complete, I think I'll scale this down to 2 seconds and then mirror it. So what I'm going to do is press S to scale, then 0.5 to cut it in half basically. And then I'm going to press T to bring up my tool shelf, and under animation, I'm just going to press mirror here, which will mirror these selected keyframes. So now if I press play, we've got this much faster 4-second long animation that ends exactly where it starts. So I'll press pause here, and I'll switch this back to my Sensei tab and press back here. To finish this off, I think we'll just go ahead and make the camera track this object. So down here where it says camera, click track selected, and maybe zoom out a bit so we're not so close to it. And if we press play, we see this kind of little generic animation here. Okay, so we've got something animated, but how do we render the animation out? So all we do to render the actual animation is come down here, and under our render settings menu, just press render animation here. But before you do that, there's definitely a few things you want to make sure that you've looked over before doing that, because rendering an animation can obviously take a lot of time. So for instance, we have an animation here that starts at second 0 and ends at second 4. And if I hold my right mouse button to drag the timeline cursor to the last frame, down here where it says FR for frame, we'll see that the total length of this animation is only 120 frames, whereas our animation itself is set up to be 600 frames. So that's why the cursor keeps going, and you can see the frame display here. That's why the cursor keeps going even though the animation frames have stopped. So you definitely wouldn't want to render all that out. Maybe only want to render a half second to a second past your actual last animation frame, depending on your specific needs. If we drag that to 4.5 seconds, we'll see that's at frame 135. So what we would want to do is make sure that we set this value to the proper length so we're not rendering out a bunch of stuff we don't need to. So let's switch that total to 135 there. The next thing we need to really figure out before we come down here and press render animation is what is the file type we're going to use to render this animation out. So if we click on our render tab of the properties panel here, this is all about rendering things. And one of the most important menus here is the first one of output. This is the file location where your animation will go. As you can see, mine's set up just to go into a folder called animation on my desktop. But you could set this up wherever you want. You could click this file button and navigate through your computer and choose a different location if you wanted to. Press cancel there. And underneath here, we have another really important value to set, which is what file type will our animation be saved out as. So by default, this is set up to PNG, and if we click on here, we can see all the different options we can save our animation out as. Typically, I use PNG for two reasons. One, it's lossless. That means no compression will happen when rendering out the animation. Also, PNGs use an alpha channel. Basically, allows you to just render out your scene without rendering the background and just keep the objects. And this gives you a huge amount of control in the final compositing process of your final animation when you're bringing together sound clips and multiple video clips and stuff like that, especially if you're using software like After Effects or Adobe Premiere or Final Cut or something where you can do lots of cool stuff to the layers. So any file type that you choose to render your animation out as under this image category, what this is going to do is create a folder of rendered still frames starting from the first frame to the last frame in the animation. When you're working with animation, this is the way to go because it will produce the highest quality video in your final result, and also it gives you the maximum amount of editing control when you're bringing clips together and making your final product. Of course, if you render your animation out as one of these image types, and I typically just recommend doing this as PNG, then you're not going to be able to immediately upload your video to YouTube or something like that if you had to have chosen one of these actual video file types here. But the advantage is you're going to have way more control, way higher quality. Also, a third benefit to doing it this way, if say you get halfway through the animation, so the computer's rendered like 100 frames, and then all of a sudden, your power goes out in your house, or the computer crashes or something, you don't lose all the frames you've animated up to that point. They're already finished, they're animated out, and so at whatever point your computer crashed or a problem occurred, you can just set the start value of your animation. Say you had animated from second 0 to second 2, which is like 60 frames, but then your computer crashed or something. You don't have to re-render the entire animation when you're doing it this way because it's just rendering still frames out to a folder. What you can do is come down here to the start value and change it to wherever you would need to start up. So say at 60 frames, which is frame 2 here, and then you would just come down here, press render animation again, and the rendering process would pick up right at that frame. So that's a huge time-saving benefit to rendering out your animation as a folder of still frames as opposed to an already compressed video file. Now, if it's just something short or a quick demonstration or something you're wanting to post on YouTube or something like that, then you may decide to use one of these file types. But if you're really wanting to make something clean and good, you're going to want to first render these out as a folder of still frames. Now, it is possible to embed sound into your animation file and actually do a lot of your sound effects and things like that straight from your Blender file. And obviously, if you're going to render out a folder of still frames as opposed to one of these video file types, then it's not going to be able to have that sound mixed with it. But you can also just render out the sound separately. So you could render out the sound file and then render out the actual animation frame. So we can use render sound and render animation, and then just bring that sound file and that folder of frames together into a video editing software. Pretty much every video editing software that exists today is going to allow you to treat a folder of rendered still frames as one of these video file types. So anywhere from the more professional grade, Adobe Premiere, After Effects, Final Cut, that kind of thing, down to freeware online or Windows Movie Maker, is going to allow you to use a folder of rendered still frames as a clip. So that's typically the way you want to do it. To render out our short 135 frame long animation, I'll go ahead and set this start value back to 0 here. What we would do is come down here and just press render animation. However, I don't want to render this animation all the way out at a full 1920 by 1080, which is what it's set to right now, 100%, because that will take longer than I need it to. I just want to render this out at a resolution where I can basically get the gist of what's going on and see if the flow of animation is working. So rather than rendering this out at a full 100%, I'm going to change this to, say, 35%. One huge part of being successful with any artistic or design medium is being able to test a lot and being able to test really quickly. Or whether you're working with 3D animation or traditional art medium or cinematography, whatever the discipline happens to be, making a lot of tests and being able to do them really quickly is going to make all the difference in how good your final product will turn out. So with that in mind, you don't want to ever waste one more second than what you have to when making tests, but also you want to be honest with yourself and acknowledge that, yes, I do need to make a lot of tests first to make sure that things are working good. And one of those ways we can speed up those tests is just by decreasing the render size with this percent value. So let's go ahead and come down here and click render animation. And we can see that this 35% of 1920 by 1080 is rendering out here, and it's going fairly quickly. And of course, over here under where it says output, all of these frames are being rendered to this folder called animation. And by the way, the animation folder doesn't have to already exist. Blender will create that folder if it doesn't find it there on the desktop. All right, so that finished rendering out. We rendered 135 frames here. And notice too that I left the use transparent option turned on. So we've rendered out these transparent PNG frames. And so if we head over to the desktop here we can see the still renders we did at the beginning of the video, just the generic render with the background and generic render with the transparent background. And here's our animation folder. So if we click on this, we can see all of the still frames that were rendered out here from 0 to 135. Okay, so if I hop back into Blender here, we can also immediately test our animation by clicking this button and pressing play animation here. And this will bring up Blender's default animation playback. And as you can see, this is playing back pretty choppy. And part of that is because these are individual transparent PNG files, which is a bit more for the Blender playback engine to process than, say, a compressed video file or something. But you have that if you want to get an immediate playback of the animation you just rendered. So I'll go ahead and click X on that. So if you were going to render this out as an actual video file type, then I would recommend using H.264. So this is become the dominant compressed video file type if you're going to go with compressed. Basically, a version of this is what's used for Blu-ray players, and it's also the kind of standard best compressed video file format when dealing with YouTube videos and stuff like that. So you could do AVI RAW, which will create a massive file and typically be pretty hard to work with unless you got some really killer hardware. But if you're going to do that, then I would just recommend rendering out, once again, as your animation as a folder of still frames, because it's going to do the same as this, only it's going to allow you to have more information, alpha information in your files. In addition to what we already talked about, if the render crashes, you'll be able to pick right back up where it started and not lose all the rendering work you had already done, in addition to having more control in the final editing phase. So I don't really recommend using AVI RAW, but if you're just wanting to render out a quick video for a demonstration or something you want to upload to YouTube immediately, I recommend using the H.264. It's going to give you the best video quality with the smallest file size. We could, for instance, select this, choose H.264. I don't want this animation rendering out to the animation folder because that's where all our still frames are. So I'm just going to backspace and erase that. And I'll just call this test render 2. Now we could just come back here and press render animation again. And even though we are seeing the transparent background being rendered with each frame here, this is not going to carry over into our actual video file, you're not going to be able to use this transparent information like you would with the folder of still rendered PNGs, which I will demonstrate here in a minute. Okay, so that's finished. Let's click here and let's play that animation back. So let's press play animation. And notice this is playing back much smoother. This is playing back the H.264 AVI file. But also notice that we've lost our transparent background. So we could click X to close the Blender player. We could click on the desktop and check that out. And here this saved exactly where we told it to. We told it to call this file testrender2 and to save it to the desktop. And so we could click on that and just see it play back in Windows Media Player or whatever you happen to be using. So that's how we would render out a file type if it was something we wanted to quickly upload to YouTube or something like that. So finally, I want to render the same short animation out again, but with Use Transparent turned off so we can see the difference between that. So what I'm going to do is up here, change this from testrender2 and just call this animation 2. And because I want Blender to think of this as a folder where it's going to store the frames, I'm going to put another backslash there. And under the image file type, I'm going to switch this back to PNG because it's good and lossless. And under here, under output options, I'm going to turn off Use Transparent and just make sure that's off there. Okay. And I'm going to render this animation out again by clicking here and pressing Render Animation. Okay, so that has finished rendering. And if we come down here and press Play Animation, we'll see the last thing we rendered out play here, and it's just these still frames here. Okay, so if we click X to exit out Blender's little animation player there, and we head over back to the desktop, we can see now we have this animation 2 folder that we created. And so I'll just set this up here next to the animation folder. Back in Blender here, I am going to be opening up Adobe After Effects because I want to sort of give you an idea of the advantages of rendering out your animation with a transparent background as opposed to rendering out with the background, or even if you had rendered it out as a video file type, which will lose that transparency, because I want to show you some of the type of stuff you can do. But that's not to say, hey, you need Adobe After Effects or whatever. I just want to display some of the advantages. If I press go back here in the Blender 3D view here, if I click on the editor type selection button, which displays one of Blender's 17 different editor types that you can choose and use, Blender does have a movie clip editor type and a video sequence editor. The movie clip editor, of course, is for cutting individual movie clips, and the video sequence editor is basically Blender's version of Premiere or Movie Maker or Final Cut or what have you. It's basically a way to bring together sound clips, video clips, and use effects and stuff like that. So using either of these is beyond the scope of this tutorial, so we're not going to really get into that, but I just want you to be aware that they are there if you want to start maybe toying around with them a little bit. But I'm going to use After Effects to show you the difference between these animation file types, but that's definitely not to say, hey, you need After Effects. So here in After Effects, I'm going to double click on my project panel here. And if I go up a folder here, so here we have this animation folder and this animation 2 folder over here. So if I click on this, usually if you're going to use a folder of rendered still frames as an animation clip, typically you can just click on the first file there and you'll see this PNG sequence pop up or something along those lines, whatever application or program you're using telling you, okay, I get that this is a sequence and you want to load this whole folder as a clip. Okay, I get it. So then we'll just press open. Then what I'm going to do is just click this and immediately drag it down to this button here, which will create a sequence for me. And if I press play here we've got these frames rendered back. And now I'm going to load the second folder here, the one without the transparent background. So I could click that, do the same thing, press open here. And I'll go ahead and rename this so we can tell the difference between it. I'll just rename this with background. And we'll go ahead and call the first one transparent background. So if I drop my with background here down into my composition here. So here's my with background, and here is the transparent background sitting right on top of it. But I could go ahead and turn the visibility of that a layer off, and here's the regular background. So if I was going to use an effect on here, such as a layer effect, like making it glow or dropping a shadow or something, under layer styles, say I put drop shadow on here, I'm not going to be able to really do much with this. I can't really see much going on. However, if I use the same layer effect on the one where we rendered the frames out with the transparent background, notice how I am able to actually put a shadow around this object. And of course I could, edit the settings here, the opacity, the different methods used, etc. And I could move this particular animation around, or I could say add a glow to it, and I could adjust that. Click on that, maybe change the color. Maybe make it a lot brighter, increase its size, what have you. And I could move this over here and close these up, press back, press play here. So this is just basically scraping the tip of the iceberg of effects and stuff. This is definitely not an After Effects tutorial video. I just want you to be aware that rendering your animation out as a folder of still frames, especially while using the transparent background option, gives you a huge amount of control and artistic freedom later on in the compositing process of your final animation. And using After Effects was just a quick way to demonstrate that. So thanks for watching this video. I hope that you've learned a bit about rendering an animation, and stay tuned for more.